So again, I'm Dr. Stephanie Szynski. I'm the director of the library. We're very appreciative of everybody who's joining us today. And I'm going to hand this over to Olivia Malunzi, the reference librarian, who's going to share some history and fascinating information, which she has had to pare down a great deal of all of the interesting things she learned about Dr. McGee in prepping this talk, to just the highlights. If you would like to hear more, I'm sure Olivia would be very happy to tell you all of the other stuff that she's discovered in her research
Even if you
over the,
don't want to hear
even if
it,
you don't want to hear it, she might do it anyway. So take it away, Olivia. Tell us about the history of Dr. McGee and the DAR Army Nursing Corps.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. There we go. Is that full sized, or are you seeing the version for that? Let me see here.
Yeah, you're showing the presenter version. You need to.
Yeah, that's what I thought. All right, let's try that on for size. How's
There you
that?
go. There you go.
Okay. All right, so as Stephanie said, I am Olivia Malunzi. I am the reference librarian here at the DAR Library, and today I'm going to be briefly covering Dr. Anita Newcomb McGee, our library founder, and the DAR Hospital Corps that she helped to establish. So Dr. McGee was born Anita Rosalie Newcomb here in Washington, D.C. She was born on November 4th, 1864. Her parents are Simon Newcomb and Mary Carolyn Hassler. And Simon was really known for his work in science, math, navigation. He ultimately is going to become a rear admiral at some point in his career for his work with navigation for the Navy. And she's the eldest of 4 children. She has one younger brother who dies as a child, and then 2 sisters who are also going to go on to great things in their life. In 1882, she graduates from private school in DC. And when I say private school, it's more like tutors. She has a very upper class education at home. And then she, as a lot of upper class people do, after they graduate high school at this time, they start traveling around Europe. And she spends 3 years attending classes at Newnham College in Cambridge and also at the University of Geneva in Switzerland. It's not really clear what she studies. She doesn't seem to be into medical studies yet, so a lot of general education. But she comes home, and on Valentine's Day in 1888, she marries William John McGee. He is several years her senior, but he is intellectually supportive of her work, what she wants to do in her life, things like that. So it is generally regarded as a good and romantic match by the people of DC. And a year later, they welcome their eldest child, a daughter named Clotho, and she is born right here in DC in July. And almost immediately after having a child, Dr. McGee decides to become Dr. McGee and go to medical school. And so she graduates in 1892 with her medical degree from Columbian University. Today, that is part of GW. And she takes first prize in dermatology, and she takes second prize in clinical medicine. So she's really a tough graduate to beat. She takes postgraduate studies in gynecology with Johns Hopkins, and then that same year, she opens up her own private practice that is focusing in women's health and gynecology. It's what we today would probably call an OBGYN. In 1893, she joins the DAR. She joins the Mary Washington chapter in DC with her mom and her sister Anna. And she is no slouch. When she joins, she turns in 3 application papers. So this is paper number 1, you can see, and then her signature. She turns in, this was a time when we let people use multiple lineages on one paper. She turns in 4 proven patriots and then 6 additional ones. So she ends up with 10 or 11 patriots by the end of her tenure with the DAR, and she gets about 10 of them on day 1. And so this is the general energy of her that we're going to carry forward. Again, no slouch. Within the first 18 months of being in the DAR, she makes 17 motions to the board. She writes 7 amendments to the DAR Constitution. She is selected as chairman for 2 committees. She's involved in 2 additional ones. She leads 1 official inquiry. She submits original research to the magazine. She becomes a voting delegate for her chapter at Congress. She temporarily serves as recording secretary general while the recording secretary is out on personal business. And then she is elected surgeon general, which is an executive position that we used to have on the board that pretty quickly fell out of favor. But that's just in the first 18 months of becoming a member. She does more than I think a lot of us could dream of doing in a lifetime. And at her first Congress in 1895, she gives her Surgeon General's report, as all execs do today at Congress as well. And she says there were no official duties listed or given to her because the country was not at war. So she decided to create them. So she wrote to the Surgeon General of the Army. He is a close personal friend of her father's and asked for permission to review US military installations for health and hygiene. And he was fine with it, but the DAR was not. They said that the DAR should not be overseeing military installations and should not be trying to tell the Army what to do. So they nixed that. So instead, she set up the first aid station and brought EMTs to help the membership during Congress, things like that. She also then closed her speech advising everyone who was not from DC not to drink the water because there was a risk of contamination and typhoid. She did say, however, that it was safe and healthy to drink the water out of the Potomac, which sounds crazy to me as someone who was raised being told not to drink out of the Potomac. A year later, her entire Surgeon General's report is, I have the honor to report that I have performed or am performing all the duties of my office, which is possibly the greatest speech given. It's short, it's sweet. Her term ends. Back then, there were one-year terms for everything except President General, and she is elected the first Librarian General because she was basically doing the organizational work of the library already. She's also working on the member directory. She's working on the magazine. She's cataloging the members. She's doing a whole bunch of stuff. In the midst of all that, unfortunately, her son Donald, who's 9 months old, passes away. He has meningitis and dies. And so, in the midst of everything that I've gone over, she's had a second child. She's been raising 2 children, and then one passes away. And this is the same year that she decides to close her private practice. As you might imagine, she has a lot going on, and she decides that it's better not to split her time, and she focuses on her DAR and philanthropy work. And this is a picture of her around this time period. This is one of my favorite quotes about her and Dr. McGee's tenure. Miss Johnson, who was a board member, said of her after about 6 months of her being Librarian General, I have never seen such work done, and I do hope that every one of you, when you have a grand library in a grand hall, will remember that the one who planted it was Dr. Anita Newcomb McGee. She is so popular, so loved for what she's doing that the next Congress, they try and re-elect her as Librarian General again. And she really does not want this job again. She says, please don't give this to me. I'm burned out. I really am not the best person for this. Her mom even stands up at Congress and says, please don't do this to my kid. Her exact quote is, perhaps the House does not know that I am Dr. McGee's mother and was with her in trying to get a successor. I wish you would elect Mrs. Darwin, who they're both recommending should be Librarian General, and allow Mrs. McGee to have a rest. She needs it. Which I've not seen another example of someone's mom standing up in Congress and trying to get them out of something, but it happened at least once. Instead, they elect her as Vice President General. So they're like, okay, you don't have to be Librarian General, but we're still going to have you be involved. The next spring, she again asks to be removed from working on the directory and some other projects because she says that war is coming. And in the event of war, she wants to be able to organize under the DAR, train nurses to help the Army or Navy. And so she doesn't want to be caught up with any other work that's going to keep her at home. She wants to be able to move and focus on that project. And she leaves the room. They decide to remove her from several projects. They accept her resignation, but then they immediately name her to 2 additional committees and make her a board member. So I don't think they really heard what she was saying because they give her just as much work as they took away from her. And she is indeed right. War does come that spring. This is the Spanish-American War. It runs from April to December of 1898. It is known as the Splendid Little War in American history because it only lasts about 8 months. And everyone thinks, oh, this is going to be great. We're going to win really fast. We're going to be home by Christmas. Not quite. So McGee again learns from close personal friend, Army Surgeon General George Sternberg, that Congress has authorized hiring contract nurses. So this is important. This is the first conflict we have after the Civil War. And in the Civil War, a lot of the nursing staff was not attached to the Army. It was civilians. It was people coming to volunteer with the military. And it's okay if you're fighting domestically to kind of do that, but this is a war where we're going overseas. We're fighting in Cuba, we're fighting in the Philippines. You need a force that you can move overseas. And so Congress says, okay, we really need to hire some staff members on a contract basis for the duration to go do this work. And Dr. McGee says, this is great, love this, but please only take professionally trained people because you don't want to get out there and find out you have people who don't know what they're doing, and then they're a liability. And George Sternberg basically says to her, we'll do what we can, but we're overworked and underpaid. And he also says that he doesn't really think they're going to need female nurses. He has a staff of about 200 male nurses. He thinks that's going to be enough. He doesn't see needing to contract out any more staff. He kind of poo-poos McGee's concerns. And she will quickly prove him wrong. So in April of 1898, the DAR, led by Dr. McGee, starts the DAR Hospital Corps. She also had written to the Navy, and the Navy is very open to this idea. They are perfectly happy to hand over all of the contract nursing issues to her. And so April 1898, again, the war starts on the 21st, by the end of the month, she's already screening all nurses for the Navy. By May, the War Department, so the Army, has started sending all of their nursing correspondence to the DAR. Basically, they got flooded with letters, flooded with volunteers. Sternberg quickly realizes that he's out of his league, and he says, you know what, actually, this would be really nice. Could you please take over vetting these women? On May 24th, 1898, Dr. McGee reports to the DAR board that as of the night before, she has opened, reviewed, answered, and filed every single application they've received to be a nurse. There's about 2,000 of them. She would later go on to say that less than 50% of them were qualified to be a nurse. She said only about 700 or 800 of them actually had nursing experience. The rest of them just really wanted to help any way they could, but this was not the place for them. And the way they did this was they had this office open every day formally from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Practically speaking, these women were usually in the office till midnight or later. A lot of them are working after working all day at full-time jobs. They come and they run the hospital corps to process all of these applications. And so McGee quickly realizes that she needs to have some strict qualifications for these nurses. And so these were her rules if you wanted to be a nurse in her hospital corps. You had to be between 30 and 50 years old. One of the big concerns, especially amongst military leadership, was that there was going to be, a bunch of 20-year-olds going and just flirting up a storm and not actually doing their job. And so she says, okay, we have to have someone who's mature, but is not so old that they're becoming a liability themselves, basically. This is going to get lowered once they kind of get desperate for more staff later in the war. She said you have to be trained in a nursing field. She did not require a nursing degree, but she said you have to prove you had studied with a doctor, with a nurse, worked in a hospital, things like that. You had to be of reputable character. You had to be able to produce character witnesses. A lot of those character witnesses ended up being DAR members. You had to be in good health, physically and mentally. She, again, didn't want anyone who was going to be a liability getting shipped overseas. She said that African American nurses would be considered. She said that they would serve in integrated nursing units, but the housing would be segregated. And you had to be willing and able to take an oath of allegiance to the US. Now, this doesn't mean you had to be a US citizen. There were several nurses who were immigrants or from other countries, didn't have citizenship yet, but they basically took an oath for the duration. And then there was a very high demand for immunes. And these are women who had already had things like yellow fever or typhoid, because those are the diseases that are really going to ravage through a hospital ward. And so they need someone who's already had this, who has immunity, who can work in these wards with these these highly contagious diseases. And this is where a lot of African American women get a chance to shine because they've been living in the South, they've been living in kind of swampy conditions sometimes where you get these diseases. And so this is a real niche for them to go into professionally and be an immune nurse and be leading a ward or something like that, taking care of these soldiers. These women are coming from all over. There are just independent women who apply directly to the DAR, who just cold write a letter and say, we want in. The American Red Cross is already working, led by Clara Barton, and she's actually already down in Cuba helping the civilian populations when the war breaks out. So she's already boots on the ground when this starts. The Tuskegee Training School for Nurses sends women. The Red Cross Auxiliaries, which are kind of like support networks for different Red Cross units, send a lot of women. Several religious orders of nuns send women. And then a lot of local hospitals end up caring for a specific training camp or a port. So, for instance, the Presbyterian Hospital of New York takes over taking care of all the guys coming in and out of New York City Harbor. Because, again, you're shipping out overseas, you have ships full of guys arriving, everyone's sick at once, and you need someone to take care of them. You also have the Associated Alumni of Trained Nurses Association because, again, nursing is becoming professionalized at this point. So you're starting to have things like alumni organizations. The first couple deployments finally come in June. And so in June of 1898, the Army says, you know what? You were right. We need help. Could you please send some people? And so the first 4 nurses are sent down to Key West to take care of soldiers who are infected with yellow fever. Later that month, 6 nurses are sent on a Army ship, the USS Relief, and it's just going down to Cuba, picking up soldiers and bringing them back to the US because they're sick. That's all it's doing. It's bringing boatloads of guys back. And of these ladies, I want to draw particular attention to Esther V. Hassan, who's one of the women who goes on the USS Relief. She's going to come up later in this talk. But of these women, half of the women who go to Key West end up having to resign within 6 months because they're sick. And 4 of the 6 nurses who go on the Relief have to resign within a month because they get sick. So this is a very dangerous profession. There was a reason McGee really wanted professionals going to do this work. Ultimately, Dr. McGee and the Hospital Corps are going to screen about 5,000 applications. They're going to accept 1,700 nurses out of that are qualified to do this work. 9 of those women are actually female doctors. They have their MDs, but the Army won't allow women to go be doctors in the field. They will let them go be nurses, however. So there's several women who are acting as nurses because that's as far as their medical degree will get them. By September 1898, there are 1,158 nurses under contract. This is the highest number that will be serving at one time. They're in general and field hospitals stateside. There are also units in Cuba and Puerto Rico. And the next September, the nurses are going to be cleared for duty in Hawaii and the Philippines. So they basically do such a good job, prove that they're so helpful that they keep getting sent further afield. Ultimately, in this 2-year period, 1,563 nurses serve. You'll notice that's not the 1,700 nurses that were accepted. There were several hundred women who were accepted to serve but never got deployed because the conflicts ended. The nurses actually have it pretty good. They are getting paid $30 a month, plus their basically room and board. This is pretty commensurate to military staff. The men are making about $360 a year. So when you're getting paid changes, but you're getting the same amount of money. The next year, the pay is raised to $40 a month if you're stateside, $50 a month if you're foreign port assignment. And they are really earning their money. They are doing daily 10 to 12-hour shifts, depending on how many people are sick, how many people are on the ward. After the typhoid epidemic eases, they fortunately get to go down to 8-hour shifts. They also try and go down to 8 hours when they can due to the heat, but a lot of times these women are working 12 hours a day in the heat in Cuba in an infectious disease ward. And so it is no surprise that about 10% of these women contract fevers or become sick while on duty. And we tried to track as many as we can. They tried to track as many as they can. But basically, as soon as you got sick, you were told to resign and go home. And so a lot of these women were not tracked once they left the military. And so we don't necessarily know what happened to all of them afterwards. And this really acts as a springboard for McGee for the next phase of her career. So, in recognition of her good work, in August of 1898, McGee is made acting assistant surgeon general for George Sternberg for the duration of the war. She is empowered to create a temporary Army Nurse Corps, so she's empowered to formalize what she's already been doing with DAR. And she is the only woman who is allowed to wear an officer's uniform. And she will wear not the uniform, but her medals for the rest of her life. And this is kind of the classic portrait of Dr. McGee with all of her medals. She starts immediately forming the Army Nurse Corps. As soon as the Army starts putting together pay rules, things like that, she writes literally the book on military nursing. A year later, she's going to write the bill to establish a permanent nurse corps within the Army, again, kind of temporarily. And in 1901, the Army Reorganization Act basically copies and pastes what she's already written to develop a permanent Army Nurse Corps. And the first 200 nurses to join the Army Nurse Corps are all veterans from the Spanish-American War that Dr. McGee vetted. And they now, because there's been formalization, qualify for campaign medals. They qualify for ribbons. They can have their own insignia. Their insignia is shown here. And this also means that they qualify based on past service. So they all get a Spanish-American War ribbon. At the same time, again, McGee is helping to form the Navy Nurse Corps. And it will not be until 1908 that they get their first nurses, but they're starting the paperwork in 1900. And the first 20 nurses who are hired are known as the Sacred 20. They're shown here in this photo. And their first supervisor is Esther Hassan, who was one of those first women who went to the USS Relief. And she is in the center of that picture with an arrow pointed to her. So she makes a whole career out of nursing. She's going to do this until she retires. At the end of 1901, Dr. McGee resigns as president of the Army Nurse Corps. Now that it's set up, it's self-sufficient, she leaves. She very strongly believed that it should be led by a nurse. And she was the first to admit she was not a nurse. She was a doctor. So she stepped down. She handed this over to Mrs. Dita Hopkins Kinney, who's shown here. Mrs. Kinney was a nurse, so she was the kind of second in command. She took over. And again, a couple months later, Dr. McGee gives birth to her second son, Eric. So again, everything she's done the whole time, she's had 2 small children and she's been pregnant for part of it, which is also mind-blowing to me. She does not stop there. She immediately keeps her eyes out and goes for the next military conflict she can find, which is the Russo-Japanese War, which is another short war from 1904 to 1905. And actually, in October of 1903, McGee writes to the Japanese government and says, hey, it looks like you're about to go to war with Russia. Would you like me and some nurses to come help train your nursing staff to take care of your army? And the Japanese government basically writes back and says, no, we're not there yet. Like we're still in negotiations. Nothing's going to happen. A couple months later, in February 1904, the Russo-Japanese War breaks out. And Japan says, you know what, actually, that's very kind. Yes, please come help us. And so they accept an offer for nurses to come for 6 months to train staff. And so Dr. McGee is given the rank of Superior of Nurses, which is basically equivalent to being an Army officer in the Japanese Army. She brings 9 women with her. All 10 women who are shown here agree to work without pay. Again, Dr. McGee is wearing all of her medals in the middle. Like I said, she'll continue to do that her whole life. And they really do it all. They go visit a hospital ship. They go to POW camps. They go out to field hospitals in Korea. They're traveling all over occupied territory right up to the front lines. And in November, the nurses actually return home, but McGee stays on as a military medical attaché to observe battles. And she's present at the Battle of Mukden, which until the Battle of the Somme in World War I is the longest running land battle going on. And she's there to basically make sure that everything's taken care of medically. This is a really good example of the process that McGee and her nurses were trying to get going in Japan. So on the left, we see Dr. McGee and another nurse, and they're observing a leg amputation in Hiroshima. On the right, we see a hospital scene at one of the POW camps, and you have a full Japanese surgical staff. So really, they were not trying to do the work, they were trying to train people to do the work themselves. And in recognition of her service, Japan gives McGee several medals. She gets the Imperial Order of the Precious Crown, which is still the highest order and honor that a non-Japanese citizen can get from the government. She gets a special member's badge for the Red Cross of Japan, and she gets 2 different Russo-Japanese service medals. And this is actually one medal, just both sides shown. And she goes home, and she spends most of the rest of her career working on pensions and trying to fight Congress to get recognition for her nursing staff. So nurses who qualify in the Spanish-American War don't qualify for pensions for a couple of reasons. First off, they enter the service before there's a formal nurse corps. They're just kind of contract nurses, and contractors aren't pensioned, so their service doesn't count. A lot of them didn't serve for 90 days because they got sick or the war ended or, their assignment changed and the paperwork's kind of a mess. And so they don't qualify in terms of service. And then also there is finally a law passed that says nurses can get pensions, but it very specifically says only Civil War nurses can get pensions. So these women are kind of blocked out using that. So McGee thinks that this is unfair. And in the meantime, while she's working with Congress to try and get these pensions, she establishes DAR pensions for all of these women for the remainder of their lives. A lot of these women are single, they either never marry or they're widows, and so they're the sole breadwinners of their house. They really need this money. And so the DAR actually pays out pensions to these Spanish American war nurses about $30 to $45 a month, so about what they were making in wages for the rest of their lives. McGee joins and works with the Order of Spanish American War Nurses. This is her with the arrow pointed at her at the inaugural meeting in 1900. And one of their main jobs is they're trying to raise funds for a Spanish American War Nurses Monument to recognize the women that they've lost. She also starts independently tracking every nurse she can. She's the one who writes job references for them. She gives testimony for their pension hearings to Congress. You have women who don't have any other proof of service besides McGee writing and saying, yes, this is when you mustered in, this is when you got your telegram, this is when you went, all this other stuff based on the DAR records that she's been keeping. So she really is the one keeping this going, holding this together, because these women, again, are not recognized as being formally part of the military. So in 1917, there are only 14 Spanish American war nurses receiving pensions, and they are doing so because every single one of them has had an act of Congress passed to specifically give that woman a pension. Usually it's someone who has gross injuries, they're in a very special circumstance, things like that, and McGee provided testimony for these women. In 1920, Spanish American War military veterans will qualify for pensions. They basically recognized that the war was not that long. We're going to kind of waive the 90-day requirement, but this doesn't include nurses. Nurses have to wait 2 more years to qualify for pensions. 4 years later, in 1926, nurses are finally going to get full military benefits, so they can be buried in Arlington, for instance. They can go to a VA hospital. They can do all these things that are really important for someone who, worked on an infectious disease ward and got sick and now has lifelong medical issues because of that. In 1929, however, there are still 11 nurses receiving DAR pensions because for whatever reason, they don't qualify for a federal pension or they're not recognized as having served. So the DAR is still paying 11 women their pensions. The Nurses Monument that McGee has been working on finally comes to fruition. In 1905, the Spanish American War Nurses Monument is unveiled in Arlington to honor all the nurses who died in service. And this photo is her daughter, Clotho, who's now 15, at the monument unveiling. in May, and it is in Section 21, which in Arlington is known as the nurses section. And it's because there are so many nurses buried there from the Spanish-American War and World War I. And that was not really intentional, but it ended up working out that way. And so it's been kind of honorarily renamed. McGee does not slow down at all. I would expect nothing less from her, but she just keeps going. So she gets a job briefly lecturing on hygiene at the University of California, Berkeley. She does not really like teaching. She quits after about a year. I personally think it's a little bit too calm for her. She starts writing pamphlets about the history of nursing, the history of the Army Nurse Corps, the history of the Spanish-American War, the history of the DAR, things that she's been intimately involved in. And in September of 1912, her husband William passes away in DC. He's had cancer for a while. And so she has now basically, not that she needed it, but she has free reign now to go travel and do what she wants. And one of the first things she does is she goes and visits Jamestown with a group of DAR women. And that's the photo you're seeing here. And I've circled her all the way in the front right because, as you can see, circled in green, she is still wearing all of her medals. Again, like I said, she's going to wear them till she dies. She wears all of her military medals everywhere, even to visit Jamestown. She continues to act for the Army Nurse Corps. She's an advisor to the new directors. She's writing articles for the Red Cross Courier and Time on nursing and the military. She starts writing her family history because, of course, she does. She's continuing to do DAR work. She is elected Historian General a couple times, so that's now 3 executive positions she's held. She resigns from the DAR in 1916 for the first time and rejoins in 1922. And based on that timing, I can't prove it, but it's kind of interesting that she resigns right when we're thinking about getting into World War I and then kind of comes back once the smoke has settled on that. I kind of think she would have gone and gotten more involved if they would have let her. She starts splitting her time between homes she has in Massachusetts and North Carolina. And unfortunately, in 1930, her second son, Eric, passes away in Rochester. So she now has buried her husband and 2 of her children. Clotho is still alive. She actually stays in Berkeley and gets married. And Dr. McGee will resign from the DAR again in 1932. And she will not rejoin for the rest of her life. On October 5th, 1940, Anita Newcomb McGee passed away at home. She had lived in DC in her family home that she inherited from her father in the last couple years of her life. She's buried with full military honors in Arlington, next to her father in Section 1. Her dad, again, is a Rear Admiral, so he gets to be buried in Arlington. So she actually has kind of 3 memorials to her. She has the family mausoleum crypt thing all the way on the left. She's got a DAR marker in the middle from the DC DAR, and she also has a military tombstone because she was the acting assistant surgeon general of the US Army during Spanish-American War. At the time when Anita McGee dies, there are still 4 nurses on the DAR pension roll being paid, and they're going to stay there all through World War II. The last Spanish-American War nurse on a DAR pension who dies in April 1955. Her name's Miss Myrtle Lamb. She's 82 years old, and her obituary goes on for a while about her service. So just in terms of thinking how long this legacy lasts, I mean, it goes till today, but the fact that there was a woman alive in 1955 who was still drawing a pension from the DAR because she didn't qualify for a US military pension. And Dr. McGee's legacy, as I said, lives on. In 1965, the DAR established the Dr. Anita Newcomb McGee Medal at the invitation of the Army, and it is pictured here, an artist rendering of it. This is given every year at Congress to the Nurse of the Year. The DAR is not involved in selecting this. The nurse is chosen by the Army Medical Service Board, and it's someone who's shown distinguished service, going above and beyond, things like that. And so I wanted to kind of call out some of the very interesting nurses that have won this award over the years. So the first person to win was Captain Linda Bowman. She won in 1967. She was actually an educator at a hospital in France, and so she flew from France to receive this award at Congress. To date, the only posthumous winner is pictured here. This is First Lieutenant Sharon Ann Lane. She received the award posthumously in 1970. She is the only nurse killed by a direct result of enemy fire in the Vietnam War. Other nurses passed away. She was the only one who was directly shot. Her award was accepted by her parents, and she is one of only 8 women listed on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in DC here. And she passed away about a month before her 26th birthday. So this is her at her nursing school graduation shortly before she shipped out. The career that the DAR seems to have followed the most is for Lieutenant Colonel Hazel Johnson. She was a lieutenant colonel when she won the award in 1971, but she's shown here throughout her career. The DAR not only gave her this award, DAR members attended her promotion to the head of the Army Nurse Corps. They attended her promotion to Brigadier General. The DAR went to her retirement party, and the DAR went to her funeral. So they were there with her all the way through. The first male winner of the McGee Award was Lieutenant Colonel James Vail in 1984. And I just think the first child attending is sweet because in 1994, Colonel Irene Rich won the award, and she dedicated her acceptance speech to her young daughter, Judy, who was in the audience and had come as her guest of honor. So I always struggle how I'm going to close presentations, and I've decided to use someone else's words to describe McGee because I think they're great. The President General Manning, during the Spanish-American War, said, "Dr. McGee wishes to speak." This was during Congress. Everyone was talking over her. "Dr. McGee wishes to speak, and it is worth your while to give her your attention. She always repays you." So, does anyone have any questions about anything?
So far, we've got no questions in the chat. Olivia, I'm assuming that there has never been a mother-daughter or a father-daughter pairing that's both won the nursing award at this point.
No, there are duos that have won it. There are trios that have won it together. But those were like coworkers who like worked on something together.
So they nominated
Actually,
everybody.
right. And in 2021, actually, there was not a single winner. It went to every nurse serving for COVID service, basically. And so I think the medal that year actually was given to like the National Museum of the Army or something because it wasn't going to someone, it was going to everyone who was serving.
We can't pick one of you right now. It's too much. We're just going to
No, and it
all of
was
you.
it was all of you are going above and beyond, so we're going to give it to all of you.
Where was that second marker, the one that DAR placed for Dr. McGee? Where is that?
It's on the side of her family tombstone. So like
Okay.
on one side is her dad's dates and her mom's dates, and then kind of on the other side is her dates, and then the DAR was like, also we're going to take this side and make 2 of these sides about your kid. Because she also didn't really qualify to be buried in Arlington. She was not put in Arlington for her service originally. She was put in Arlington because she asked to be buried with her parents.
Yeah.
So, I mean, even she couldn't get into Arlington initially.
So someone did ask, we will be putting the video of this up on the DAR's website under the events or recordings of our events. But someone's wondering if we're going to publish some of this information or put it together in some way that might be shared. And that is something we'll look into. I know Olivia's got reams of material that she didn't actually include in the presentation itself because we didn't want to run this over for 2 hours. But
I feel like I could write, I mean, people keep telling me I should write a book about her because I know too much at this point.
Someone asked if DAR or Tuskegee reported the nurses from presumably the Tuskegee Institute that were participants. Do we have a list of those names, or is there a partial list?
Yes. So, the Women in Military Service to America, I think that's the acronym. It's WIMSA, WIMSA. it started out as a digital platform. Now they have a physical space. But one of the projects DAR was involved in kind of getting that going. And one of the projects was they tried to hunt down every single woman who was kind of verified by the DAR. And so there's a book they've published. We have a copy in our library, and it lists out every nurse and basically where she came from. Her recommendation. I guess I can stop sharing my screen so y'all can see me. And basically who recommended her, you know, who was her character witness, everything we know about her. And so that does include women who came from Tuskegee. The other thing is Dr. McGee's papers are held by the National Archives. They're in DC here. And she had like a personal file on every single woman, and she tracked them till the day they died, because again, she's the one who's writing to the War Department, writing to the VA, writing to hospitals. She's writing women's obits that she hasn't seen in 50 years, you know. This really was a labor of love for her whole life.
Someone else also thinks you should write a book. So. All right. So thank you everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Olivia. Round of applause.
Absolutely.
For the presentation. Very interesting. Fascinating to learn that the library has kind of always been like this.
Yeah.
We've always been a little intense as part of the DAR,
Yeah.
starting with Dr. McGee. Maybe her spirit infuses us when we get here. So if anyone has any follow-up questions, you can email askthelibrary@dar.org, which is our reference email. And again, we will be posting the video of this up onto the website in a few days, hopefully, so people can share it. And thank you all for attending.
Yep. Have a good afternoon or morning, wherever you are.
All right. Bye, everybody.